Thank you for being here with us tonight for this deeply important conversation, Voices Against Sanctions, National Teach-In, an initiative powered by RootsAction. My name is Hanieh Jodat, and I am the Senior Partnerships Coordinator with RootsAction, Strategist with Defuse Nuclear War, and the co-chair of No War with Iran campaign. Before we begin, we're going to do things a little bit differently tonight. I want to ask you all who are attending, who are with us tonight, to take a moment with me. Wherever you are, whether you're in your home or in your car or at your desk, I want you to take a pause. I want you to take a breath and think about this. How long could your family go without access to medicine? What would you do if your child needed surgery, but the equipment was banned? And what would it feel like to stand in line for hours every week just to get food and still not have enough? That is not hypothetical. That is the daily reality for millions of people around the world living under US sanctions. We're told that sanctions are a nonviolent tool, that they are smarter than war, that they target regimes, not the people. But tonight, we're here to talk about the truth. Sanctions are war, economic war, and the casualties are overwhelmingly civilians. They are mothers, their children, they are elders, their students, their nurses, engineers, poets, activists, and workers. And they are dying. As someone who comes from the country of Iran, I've seen this firsthand. Sanctions are not abstract policy, they're a noose around the necks of entire populations. They cut off access to cancer drugs, to dialysis machines, to basic medical supplies. They inflate the prices of everyday necessities until even bread becomes a luxury. They hollow out economics, crush civil society, and isolate communities already struggling under authoritarianism or instability. In Iran, sanctions have devastated the middle class and the working poor. Hospitals have been forced to reuse equipment meant for single use. People delay treatment because they simply cannot afford it or because it's not available. There are parents who go without meals so their children can have milk. There are students who drop out of school because the future feels too impossible. There are women who bear the burnt of every single crisis because they always do, and yet are written out of the conversation by the very powers claiming to protect them. Let's be very clear. These sanctions are not mistakes. They're deliberate acts of violence enforced through bureaucracies and political narratives that dehumanize entire nations. They're framed as necessary pressure, as if starving people into compliance is acceptable foreign policy. They're justified in the name of democracy, but imposed with zero accountability and zero regard for international law. And they do not work. There is evidence that sanctions bring about the policy changes that claim to seek. Instead, they entrench governments, destroy internal reform movements, and alienate the very people they claim to save. Sanctions don't isolate governments, they isolate people, and they allow the powerful to escape while the vulnerable suffers. Tonight, we'll hear from people who have worked tirelessly on the ground in Cuba, in Venezuela, and across the global south. People who understand that solidarity is not just a slogan, it is a practice. And that practice means naming this violence, challenging these policies, and organizing together for justice. You will hear about the myth of smart sanctions and the real cost of economic warfare. We'll hear about the resistance that communities have built in spite of these sanctions, how they care for each other, feed each other, heal each other, and fight for dignity. We'll talk about how we, here in the US, must do more than bear witness. We must act, because our government cannot claim to be the force for peace while enforcing collective punishment. It cannot speak for human rights while cutting off insulin. It cannot preach democracy while imposing policies that make democracy impossible. Our silence enables this system, but our collective voice can disrupt it. So tonight, I do ask that you please not just listen with your minds, but with your hearts. That you consider your role in global movement to end economic violence, and that you leave this space with renewed commitment to stand with people, not with punishment. Thank you so much for all of you for being here. With that said, I would love to introduce our very first speaker, Danny Valdes, who is the co-chair of DSA's Cuba Solidarity Working Group, a Cuban-American organizer. Danny has worked to end the U.S. blockade and all sanctions that punish working people, building solidarity across the borders. Danny, I do want to lead with this question for you. You've been on the front lines of organizing around Cuba. As the co-chair of the DSA Cuba Solidarity Working Group, can you talk a little bit about what the reality looks like for Cuban communities under U.S. sanctions and how organizers here can stand in solidarity?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. As was said, my name is Danny Valdes. I'm the co-chair of the Democratic Socialists of America Cuban Solidarity Working Group. It's a mouthful. There's actually more, like International Committee and all this other stuff, but we'll leave that out. And it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. And to answer your question at the forefront, in the 90s, the USSR collapsed, and that led to a very difficult economic situation in Cuba. And it's a time that they call the special period there. It's a time when, a lot of the conditions that you were speaking about were present in Cuba, and it took them a long time to even get to a tolerable place. I would say the situation in Cuba right now is worse than that time. Um, there's just a palpable sense of desperation on the island right now. People are scrounging for literally everything. We're talking even down to like toilet paper is difficult to get. Um, and shortages of all kinds of fuel, of equipment, of just basic needs. I'm sure you've all seen in the news recently they can't even keep the power grid in Cuba in a stable enough place to have consistent electricity. They haven't had a full 24-hour day of electricity in over a year. And some of these are planned brownouts, and some of them are just, the entire island's grid goes down. And I grew up in Miami. I'm a Cuban American. I have Cuban American parents in Miami, and all that you think that means I grew up with is what I grew up with. And what I heard growing up was this was a product of a corrupt government, that this was a product of communism, that this was a product of many other factors. But I don't think I ever heard mentioned the outsized role that the U.S. blockade plays in Cuba, and it's just not really discussed. In fact, my grandmother thinks the blockade is mostly just Cuban propaganda to make excuses for their shortcomings. So it's a very sensitive topic still today in the Miami Cuban community, but there is, I think, some recognition starting because we have newer Cubans who are coming all the time, and they've only grown up under the sanctions regime, and they understand. They have more of an understanding of what role U.S. sanctions have played in contributing to the state of Cuba right now. So when we talk about the blockade, it's an interesting, morbidly interesting regime, because most of the time when we're dealing with sanctions, even though they have effects beyond their target, most of the time sanctions are targeted against an institution or an individual or a bank, or in Cuba, the reason we call it a blockade is because it is indeed sanctions against an entire country, just blanket sanctions. There's no wiggle room there. There's no targeting. There's not even they're not even pretending that these are targeted sanctions. It's the most explicit regime change focused program of sanctions that I think that the U.S. has. That's been the stated goal from the beginning. It began as an executive order in 1962 from JFK. And since then, it has evolved into this complex web of executive orders, State Department policy, and actual U.S. law. So there are congressional laws on the books, like the Helms-Burton Act, that were passed during the Clinton administration, that codified the certain elements of the blockade, and subsequently makes it much more difficult to repeal and much more difficult to navigate around, because now we're talking about overturning law in Congress in order to make real progress on what the blockade does and how it affects Cubans every day. So it is this complicated web of things. There are some more modern tactics that have been used. Do you have any other questions, or should I just keep on
Go ahead.
going? Or
Yeah.
okay, great.
Yeah.
So one thing that's important and is a more modern development of sort of how the blockade has evolved is this list that the U.S. State Department maintains called the State Sponsors of Terrorism list. There are 4 countries on this list. I think they are North Korea, Iran, Syria, and Cuba. These are the 4 countries that are on this list. And this is a list that once you are on it, you become the target of not just direct sanctions to your country, but what the basic effect is, it internationalizes the blockade, because now third parties, even that are not the United States or Cuba, risk getting sanctioned by doing business with what the U.S. calls a state sponsor of terror. And there are many examples of Swiss companies, even at the height of COVID, there was I think it was a Swiss company that tried to sell air ventilators to Cuba, and that transaction was not allowed to happen, because most of the money that moves in the world moves through the United States. There's a global banking system called SWIFT that processes every digital financial transaction in the world, basically. There are alternatives being built up right now as a result of this sort of like U.S. imperial regime that has been going on. But the State Department will flag a transaction, and that company or that country will be sanctioned, often to the point of collapse in terms of companies. So it's a very serious risk to do business with Cuba. Some countries like China are powerful enough to sort of like take on the risk, but many just aren't willing to, and that's sort of understandable. And what it does is it financially and economically isolates Cuba from the rest of the world, to the extent it goes so deep that Cuban diplomats who work in other countries often cannot open bank accounts in foreign countries. And so the Cuban government literally mails them cash in order to pay them. And this is true of the Cuban economy. They don't have credit. They don't have access to international credit markets. And so nearly everything that Cuba imports, and it is an import economy. People debate about whether that was a mistake in the 90s to transition to importing so many things. That can be discussed. But they do import a lot of the stuff that they need, which is part of the reason they're in the situation that they're in right now. Everything has to be paid for in cash. In fact, if you go to Havana and you look out onto the bay, you will see cargo ships just docked out there, just waiting for, cash. And these are like necessary items, right? These are like basic staples that are just sitting there being withheld from people, because the Cuban government has to choose every day. Are we going to feed people? Or are we going to pay to import things, right? No other country in the world runs without credit. It's an impossible situation that they're in. They're really kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. And what I always say, even to to people like my parents and people who don't like the Castro regime and don't like communism. Exactly what you said at the beginning, Hanieh. It's like if you want change in Cuba, the best thing that you can do. I don't care if you want it to remain a socialist country, like let's say I do, or you want it to become, that there's a Starbucks on every corner of Havana. Neither of those things can happen until the blockade is lifted because Cuba is stuck. They are literally frozen in time. That's the thing people say about Cuba as one of its charms. But it is frozen in time because of US sanctions. They have those classic American cars from the 50s that they fix up with like German parts and Russian parts because they can't import new cars from the United States, right? Like it's very difficult to do. And then we get into the problem of how much money people actually have in their pocket, which is not very much. So all of these things compound into a situation that is is untenable. It's been untenable for years, and there was some hope or with the Obama thaw that things would be different. And all they prepared for this. They pumped millions of dollars into refurbishing their sort of tourist area. They built a whole new market to welcome American tourists. That's what they were counting on. And Trump pulled the rug out from under them by reversing everything Obama had done and re-adding Cuba to this state sponsors of terrorism list. So between that and the COVID pandemic, they have had an extremely difficult 5 years in Cuba, and there are signs. Some days you read signs that things might be getting better, and other days you read signs that things are getting worse. And like I say, they're at an untenable point, and something's going to have to give one way or the other. Of course, the goal of the sanctions is to foment a right-wing reactionary movement that takes over Cuba. That's what they want. So far, it speaks. I think it says a lot about Cubans' trust in their government that has not happened. And I don't really see that happening as an outcome because there is a deep social fabric that has been woven with revolutionary, ideas and the way that we conduct our society in Cuba. But yeah, it's just terrible. And I was saying a little bit earlier that it's often difficult to relay what's going on in Cuba in an impactful way in light of like the genocide in Gaza or in light of other just terrible sanctions regime. But to me, we are purposely starving an entire nation of people. That is what we are doing. The gravity of that, to me, there aren't bombs falling. There isn't a military, but a lot of the same critiques that we levy at Israel for how they dealt with Gaza even before this war are actively true in Cuba, and not just funded by the United States, directly being done by the United States.
That's right.
And so I'm hoping that we can raise the cause of Cuba to the same level of concern that we do for all the other countries that unfortunately are under our boot.
Yeah, and I could draw so many similarities between, my mother's thought process, when it comes to the Iranian regime and, the challenges that sometimes we do have in our household when we talk about, sanctions do not lead to regime change. You're starving the very population that is meant to be out there organizing. And when mothers who are organizers in Iran, women who are organizers in Iran, who can barely afford to put food on their table, how can they go out there and protest, right?
That's
How can
right.
they
There's very little time for politics for
very
you when your
when you're
main
starving?
concern is where your next meal is going to come
That's
from.
right. That's right. So
Yeah.
if you can stick around, Danny, we do have a couple
Yep.
questions for you, but I do want to go to our next speaker, a dear, dear, dear friend of mine, Leonardo Flores, who is a co-founder of the Venezuela Solidarity Network. He previously worked as an organizer with Code Pink and as an analyst with the Venezuelan embassy in the US. Leonardo was born in Venezuela and maintains a very close tie to social movement that have transformed the country over the past 26 years. Leo, you have traveled extensively and worked very closely with movement resisting economic warfare in Venezuela. Can you share how sanctions have shaped everyday life there and what the international community often overlooks when we talk about Venezuela?
Sure. And first, let me just say thank you so much for this opportunity, Hanieh, and to the Teaching Network for talking about sanctions. Because, yeah, I think it's been a minute since we have seen a webinar exclusively focused on the issue of sanctions. And before I go into these details about how kind of the Venezuelan people are resisting and how sanctions are perceived from the outside, let me just give you a little kind of a macro overview of what's going on in Venezuela in terms of sanctions. So the Trump sanctions on Venezuela, which are really also became the Biden sanctions, because this is a bipartisan effort of economic warfare against Venezuela, those led to a 99% drop in oil revenues for a country that is almost entirely dependent on oil revenues for its economy. And estimates vary as to the economic costs of the sanctions, but about 2 months ago at the Venezuela Solidarity Network, we had an economist named Yosmed Arayan, who was a member of the Central Bank of Venezuela. And according to his own estimates, he was saying that the cost of the sanctions, including the opportunity costs, was somewhere around $1.15 trillion, something or equivalent to $340 million per day in losses that Venezuela was suffering because of these sanctions. And so what does it mean when you have a government that was previously spending, or that continues to spend actually, roughly around 80 to 85% of its budget on social investment, suddenly losing access to most of its money? Well, what it means is that there's going to be an economic crisis in the country, a massive decline in health and education and standards of living. And we see this, and we can see what happened to Venezuela through, among other indicators, through the Human Development Index, which is this indicator put out by the United Nations Development Program. And what we see is that Venezuela used to be, and this is a paraphrase of a quote from one of the UNDP officials, that in 2013, he said something like Venezuela's HDP used to be kind of stable for like 20 years. And then in the past 10 years, from 2003 on, it skyrocketed. It was on an elevator because of this investment in social programs. But now we see that Venezuela's HDI has gone back to the 2003 level. So it's almost like a 20-year loss of progress and human development in Venezuela due to these sanctions. Alina Duhan, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures, aka sanctions, on the enjoyment of human rights, she said this about the sanctions on Venezuela. She said, "The economic blockade of Venezuela and the freezing of central bank assets have a devastating effect on the whole population of Venezuela, especially those in extreme poverty, women, children, medical workers, people with disabilities or life-threatening or chronic diseases, and the indigenous population." So it's affecting absolutely everyone in absolutely all aspects of their lives, as you said at the beginning, Hanieh. And in terms of health, I don't want to steal Mark's thunder a little bit, but there is a 2019 study from CEPR that Mark wrote where they found 40,000 excess deaths in Venezuela due to the first year of Trump sanctions alone. So in 1 year, an extra 40,000 people died. And that was 8 years ago, 7 years ago. So in that time frame, we can expect at least 100,000, if not more, people who have died in Venezuela due to these sanctions. And how do people die from sanctions? Well, it's because the health systems get totally decimated, because access to food becomes much more difficult. So, for example, in Venezuela, maternal mortality doubled. Food insecurity rose from 2% in 2013 to 14%, excuse me, 5 years later in 2018. I don't have the latest figures, but I assume they're a bit lower now. And we see this kind of everywhere in every aspect of life in Venezuela. So education, I'll just give you a personal anecdote. I have a cousin who took almost about 8 years to graduate college, not because he was a slacker. He was actually a great student, very attentive in school, but so many people left the university, including professors, that the one class or the classes he needed as a requirement to graduate with a political science degree weren't offered for several years. So he was just basically sitting around doing next to nothing because he couldn't get his degree, because the required classes were no longer offered because people had left the university. And this is an example of universities, but the same thing happened K through 12. All of these teachers suddenly left to other Latin American countries. And that really impacts not just your development at the time, but also your future career prospects. Because you show someone a resume and they're like, "Oh, it took you so long to graduate college. What happened?" You can't really go into a spiel about how sanctions really screwed up your education and your career prospects, right? But that's what happens, and that led to massive migration in Venezuela. But it's not as bad as it sounds nowadays because it seems that Venezuela has hit rock bottom. And so it's not all bad news right now. The economy in Venezuela has been growing for 3 straight years. And actually, it was 15% growth in 2022, above 9% growth in 2024. Venezuela went, and here I want to talk a little bit about how the grassroots have reacted, because the people who were most protected by the sanctions in certain ways, or not protected, but most resilient to the sanctions, were the people who were already really organized. So I'm talking about in Venezuela that refers to communal councils, which are basically like neighborhood associations where they govern themselves, and to communes. And the Venezuelan commune system really turned out to be very resilient. And not only that, but because of these grassroots efforts, Venezuela totally managed to turn around a really key aspect of its economy, which was that before the sanctions began, Venezuela was importing something around 80% of its food. And then, of course, the sanctions hit, and the sanctions affected the availability of food severely. But now, because of these changes, Venezuela is close to producing 100% of the food it consumes. So that's almost a total turnaround, and that's due to government policy and due particularly to the work done by grassroots groups to encourage local production of food. On top of that, there's a program in Venezuela called the CLAP, which means the local committees for supply and production. It basically gives boxes of food and other items, whether it's toilet paper or whatever, to families about once a month in Venezuela. And at its height, this program reached 8 million families. And this program really may have prevented a famine in Venezuela, because I'm sure folks remember 2019, 2020, 2021, there was story after story about how Venezuela was a total disaster, how it was chaos, how people were starving. Well, they weren't quite starving. They were hungry, but they weren't starving. And they weren't starving because of these efforts to put food directly into the hands of people who needed it the most. And that really saved the country in many ways. And then another aspect of how Venezuela has been able to fight back against these sanctions has been South-South cooperation. And so I want to bring up the example of Iran, because obviously you're from Iran, Hanieh, and it's another sanctioned country. And in fact, ties with other sanctioned countries have really helped Venezuela, whether it's Iran, Cuba, Russia, China. And in terms of Iran, in 2020, Venezuela was going through this really particular crisis relating to gasoline, because while Venezuela produces oil, at the time they weren't producing some of the chemicals that are used to refine oil into gasoline, some of these additives. And Iran came through. They sent not just the additives, but they sent experts to help fix Venezuela's infrastructure for producing these additives. And at different times, they also sent diesel fuel and gasoline. And that helped Venezuela be able to survive some of the worst effects of the sanctions. When we're talking about a time when there were something like millions of liters, say, of milk would be produced, and then they'd be wasted because they couldn't be able to be taken to consumers in time. And because of this kind of South-South cooperation, and not just timely shipments of gas and other goods, but helping Venezuela recover its economy and recover its infrastructure, now the country's become much more resilient. And when we look at Venezuela now from the outside, you might think, oh, things are really horrible. Things are slightly better. In fact, migration has slowed significantly in the last 3 years, despite what we may see in the media. And that's all due not just to government policy, to grassroots groups, and also to the South-South cooperation that I mentioned, which has been really key in helping Venezuela overcome some of the worst of the sanctions. I think I'll stop it there so that we can have more time for questions at the end.
Yeah, thank you so much for mentioning both speakers. Iran, I think, it's only fair that we do talk about the second, what is it now, the second most sanctioned country in the world, which is, my home country where I was born. And I do want to take a moment here before we move on to Mark's segment, who we're very happy to hear from, to kind of conclude everything for us. I do want to take this moment to highlight Iran, a country of 90 million plus million, who just entered a devastating 12-day war with Israel just recently. To me, they always say sanctions are peaceful alternative to war, but in reality, they're really silent weapons of war, right? And when you strip away diplomatic language, what we're really left with is policy that starves civilians, blocks access to medicine, devastates economies, and silences the very people, the very working class people who are moving towards progress. Unfortunately, Iran is one of the most sanctioned countries in the world right now, second only to Russia. And these sanctions are not targeted, they're suffocating. And they have not weakened the state, which is what they're meant to do, supposedly. And they have not brought about the democratic reform claimed in policy memos. What they have done is collapse the middle class, crush civil society, and really deepen the grip of hardline power in Iran. In 2015, following the nuclear deal, JCPOA, there was a brief moment when civil society in Iran could actually breathe. Organizations began reconnecting with the international community. Women's rights campaigns found new energy. Artists, environmentalists, students, they could finally begin to imagine a different kind of future. But when the US unilaterally withdrew from the agreement in 2018 under the Trump administration and reimposed sanctions under the so-called maximum pressure campaign, that opening door slammed shut, right? And the economy plummeted. The real lost 90% of its value. Inflation surged past 50%. Medicine became scarce. And even though humanitarian goods are technically exempt, banks refuse to process transactions, fearing secondary sanctions. Children with cancer were left without treatment. Patients with epilepsy, hemophilia, they were told their lives were simply too risky to be a bank transaction. And while the people suffered, the state adapted. Hardliners in Iran have learned how to survive under sanctions. In fact, they thrive in them. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which controls major sectors of the economy, took over trade routes, smuggling operations, black market imports. As legitimate businesses shut down, state affiliated entities filled the void. And as civic organizations lost funding, hardliners' networks consolidated control. What sanctions have done is this: they've empowered the unaccountable and disempowered the hopeful. They have extinguished the oxygen that the civil society needs to grow, connection, access, stability, and replaced it with isolation, scarcity, and fear. In 2020, as COVID ravaged Iran, humanitarian organizations warned of catastrophe. The UN called for the easing of sanctions. Iranian doctors begged for supplies, but nothing changed. The sanctions remained untouched, unquestioned, while people died from the lack of ventilators and basic protective equipment. And let's be very clear and be very honest. This isn't just about what happens inside of Iran. These policies ripple outward. Iranian Americans trying to send money to loved ones are blocked. Students are denied access to tuition payments. US nonprofits offering disaster relief are threatened with legal action. And we've criminalized compassion, not to punish the regime, but to maintain the illusion of leverage. So, what has this accomplished? It has not stopped the enrichment of uranium in Iran, and it did not. It has not curbed Iran's regional activities. It has not brought political prisoners back home, but it has created a society where survival takes precedence over dissent, where people are too exhausted to dream of change, let alone demand it. And this isn't an oversight, it's a future of economic warfare, really. And while policy experts may debate effectiveness and officials may cite strategy, the truth is very simple. Sanctions are collective punishment. And who knows better than the Iranians who live in Iran right now, starving for just simple bread and rice and meat, right, to feed their children. They punish children for the decisions of generals. They punish poets, professors, shopkeepers, while powers adapt, survive, and hardliners continue becoming more totalitarian. So, Mark, I'm very delighted to introduce you as our next speaker, but I would love to talk about your accomplishments, which there are so many to name. Mark Weisbrot is the co-founder of Center for Economic and Policy Research. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. He's the author of the book Failed: What the Experts Got Wrong About Global Economy. And he's the co-author with Dean baker of Social Security, the phony crises, and has written numbers of research papers on economic policy. His opinion pieces have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Guardian, and almost every major newspaper, as well as in Brazil's largest newspaper, Folha de Sao Paulo. Hopefully, I pronounced that right. He appears regularly on national and local television and radio programs. Mark, your research has helped so many of us understand the microeconomic and system implications of US sanctions. Can you walk us through the broader global impact and what it means for how we define human rights and international law?
Try and thank all three of you, Danny and Hanieh, and for providing so much of the information that I can now skip, but also is really important. That's the important part. And yeah, I'll say, the things that you asked about it, but also I do want to say something about how we might be able to change it, because we spend a lot of our life at the Center for Economic and Policy Research trying to move Congress. And it's not because we have any illusions about anything, but it's because they're the least unaccountable part of government that we have. And it is possible over time, and it has been possible to move them on these kinds of issues. First of all, to start out with the sanctions, they really are, as Hanieh said, they're a form of warfare, and they mainly target the civilian population. And I've focused, and we have focused on the broad economic sanctions, the ones that target a big sector, like in Venezuela oil or Iran oil sector, or the whole economy with the financial sanctions. And they really are deadly. In fact, they kill hundreds of thousands of people in developing countries. There's now 25 countries under U.S. sanctions. That's grown enormously over the last few decades. You've already said some of the ways in which they kill people, but I think the biggest part is really the international finance. When they can cut that off, and Danny mentioned the states that sponsor terrorism stuff in Cuba. That's an example of it. And of course, Venezuela is an extreme example. And they cut off everything. And Iran too. The imports of medicine actually were a lot of medicines were cut off. There were, I think, 73 drugs during the sanction period that have been cut off, and 32 of them were on the World Health Organization list of essential medicines. And and of course, they had exceptions for these supposedly, but it doesn't work, right? Because that's how the sanctions work. They call it overcompliance, but it's really something that the sanctions do. They encourage everybody to just boycott the country as much as possible, so they don't end up with secondary sanctions or other kinds of troubles. And also, just to say something about how the sanctions relate to this so-called system of global governance, there really are. You can see it even right now in Iran, right? It's a regime change operation, and then when they don't succeed in doing that, then they bomb the country, and then you have the same thing. Look at Brazil. That's right now a regime change operation again. And I'm bringing these up because this is part of what the sanctions are intended to do, and it's very intentional. In fact, you had Pompeo in 2019. He was asked about the sanctions on CBS News, and he said things are much worse for the Iranian people, referring to the sanctions, and we are convinced that this will lead the Iranian people to rise up and change the behavior, he says, of the regime, which really is a regime change. And then this is, I think, it is a form of warfare. It's a, it actually fits the, if you want to think about all the horrible, indefensible things about it, they also fit the kind of classic Oxford English Dictionary definition of terrorism, the use of violence to achieve political ends. And that's really what they are. And this is just to get back to Congress for a second, because I'm going to come back to that. You had, and I always bring this in because this was one of the best things we got out of Congress when Jim McGovern was the chair of the House Rules Committee, which is a very powerful position in Congress. In 2021, he actually wrote a letter to Biden asking him to get rid of the sanctions on Venezuela. And he said, and here I'll quote it, the impact of sectoral and secondary sanctions is indiscriminate and purposely so. He's talking about the broad sanctions. And he said, although U.S. officials regularly say the sanctions target the government and not the people, the whole point of the maximum pressure campaign, and that's the one that Trump started in 2017, is to increase the economic cost to Venezuela. Economic pain is the means by which the sanctions are supposed to work. And so that is what everybody knows, but it's hard to get people to say it. Now, the reason I emphasize this so much, and then there's the illegality too, which, Hanieh mentioned in terms of collective punishment, right? It's a violation. If there were a war going on, it's just a technicality that there isn't. It's a violation of the Geneva Convention. And so it's a war crime if they were actually shooting each other. And so this is, and it violates all these other laws as well. But I think the fact that it is, it violates all these international laws, the OAS charter, the UN charter, and you have UN officials who have said this, by the way, that something that's, and they've written and they've researched and they've said, something that's a crime when people are bombing and shooting each other ought to be a crime when they're not. Okay. So I think the reason why all these things, you can think, well, these people are cynical, they don't care. A lot of them don't, a lot of them just give in to pressure, whatever. But I think that the way we're going to win this is when it becomes indefensible, okay? When it becomes no. Because why are they so attached to this, okay? And why has it increased so much over time, the use of sanctions? As, because they have other means to threaten and punish economies. They control the IMF. They wrote the rules of the World Trade Organization, and they can use that too sometimes. They have all kinds of ways of now Trump has weaponized tariffs, right? And there you can see the regime change. I mean, this is the same president who helped put Lula in jail and keep him there in 2018 so he couldn't run for president. Okay. And now he's got another regime change operation. He says, you got to not prosecute Bolsonaro for trying to overthrow the government because, we want him there. Well, why do they want him there? Because they want to overthrow the government. Okay. So that's what all this stuff, obviously, and people here, I'm sure your audience already knows this, but the reason I think it's so important to go through at least some of it and the record of this so-called system of global governance that is being used to punish any country that is not basically obedient to U.S. foreign policy. And of course, 90% or more of the time, that's also European foreign policy. They haven't really had an independent foreign policy for the last 80 years. And so that is what we're dealing with. Now, why do I think we can win? I think that if you look at the war powers resolution, that was an example, okay? That was the war in Yemen. And it started in 2015, and it was completely absent from the media. Nobody heard of it, right? Until 2016, as a result of the kind of organizing that many of you have done, a couple senators started to talk about it in 2016. And then they kept pushing. and it got in the media for the first time. And then there were votes. And at first, there were only a few votes, and then there became more. And then finally, in 2018, it passed the Senate, a War Powers Resolution, which is using the 1973 War Powers Act to tell the president that he's got to get the military out of this war because it's not authorized by Congress. That's the law and the Constitution. And it passed both houses for the first time in history. And I'd say, well, the war kept going. But a lot of things did actually change that saved a lot of lives. They were killing, hundreds of thousands of people in Yemen, and and the U.S. was refueling the Saudi planes in midair, and they had to stop that, and they had to unblock the main port of Hodeida, where they were using to starve people, blocking the food shipments and the oil and energy shipments, and so. It was, I would even say, if it was even a normal, horrible president, horrible on foreign policy issues, they probably would have actually stopped the war. Trump just didn't care because he doesn't care. But I think that is the main reason I bring up that example is because, and it took a few years, and we were involved in it from the beginning, went to the UN first and couldn't get it done there. And so then we went to Congress. And I think that the reason it happened was exactly that. Nobody could defend it. By 2020, every presidential candidate had to say they would stop that war, a war that most people had never heard of, but they heard about it because it became an election issue as well. And so I think that is partly what we have to do here. We have to make it, and to the extent that you can get the Congress to do it, on sanctions, we had, okay, this is slow progress, but we had another letter last year, 24 members of Congress signed it, and it was co-chaired by, it was led by a co-chair of Biden's campaign. It was the year before, and it said that you had to end. It was written to Biden to end the sanctions against Venezuela and Cuba. That was the first time there was a letter like that. Now, I'm not saying it's all going to come from things like that. It was the grassroots organizing, of course, that moved members of Congress. But I think that's a big part of it. It has to become an issue that they're forced to pay attention to, and they're forced to vote on it. This is what happened. These people changed their minds because they voted on it and they were embarrassed. And they had constituents come to them and say, why are you voting to kill people in Yemen? What did they do? And so that is, I think, how we can win this fight over the long haul. There's a lot more I could say, but I think I probably went over my time already.
Mark, you did not. But I do want to say that this is going to be the first of very many conversations that we're going to continue on leading around this subject matter because it is extremely important. Danny, I do have a question for you. Oftentimes we find ourselves wanting to help, but we can't, right? Especially with regards to what's happening in Gaza right now. Just starvation of children has been one of the worst humanitarian crises that I've ever seen in my lifetime. And then, obviously Yemen and Cuba and the countries that we've mentioned on this call. How can the people in the US directly support Cuban communities today?
Yeah, I think Mark's point is really good that, often it does feel, frankly, demoralizing and futile to try to move elected officials on stuff like this. But I will say at the end of last year, DSA, our working group went all in on trying to get Biden to remove Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list. And we spent the good part of 4 months doing constituent calls and getting letters together, including one signed for the first time ever by the UAW. And really try to bring labor into it. And we won. It was a very short felt victory, but 7 days before Biden left office, he kicked off the sort of review process to have Cuba removed from this list. Of course, Trump, within an hour of being president, he signed a reversal of all of that with his stupid big black marker. But like that's an example of something where if we organize, and I think Mark is right, the level of salience that we're able to raise these issues to is very, very, very important. Despite what it may look like, politicians, they do still respond to pressure. They do still respond to their constituents making a demand on something. And us as Americans, I feel like we have a duty to do everything we can to get our government to stop doing these things. And there's tons of local organizing going on all the time, but at least in the Cuba solidarity movement, there is sort of a new generation that is cropping up inside of it, which I think is good and needed. That is trying to bring kind of a, I think the old school style that I was just talking about is a little bit 20th century, and we do need to figure out ways of raising the salience of these issues in new ways. And there are many new avenues for us to talk about these issues as well. It just takes a little bit of like a concerted effort to actually try to communicate these things in a way. And I spoke earlier about the situation in Gaza sort of taking up a lot of the oxygen when it comes to international stuff. But the opposite is also true. I have had people who have learned about Cuba or have asked me about Cuba, who are curious about Cuba, because they had a certain narrative broken for them through what's happening in Gaza. And I think we are in a moment where the traditional hegemony of the 20th century is kind of shifting. And a lot of people are saying we live in a multipolar world now. I don't know if we're quite there yet, but I think we're certainly on our way. And ironically, as Mark pointed out, that is largely like the effects of sanctions, right? Because when you deprive people, when you starve people, they're going to look for any alternative that they can. And Cuba has this recurring history with this, because when the Cuban Revolution was not an explicitly socialist or communist revolution at the outset. It was a nationalist revolution, right? It was a revolution to regain Cuba's sovereignty and economy, which was owned in vast majority by U.S. interests at the time of that. But because of U.S. hostility toward Cuba right at the outset, they gravitated toward the USSR and became kind of inseparable, and their economy became completely propped up in a sense by the USSR, which that's a bad outcome if you're trying to affect the way that these countries are shifting. And again, what we don't see is regime change, right? What we don't see is the kind of things that these policies are purported to do. And it's this vicious thing where it's like, because the countries are in a bad way, the U.S. government finds it easy to blame these governments, and it further feeds this narrative that these governments are corrupt or these governments don't care about their people, when really, like, behind the smoke and mirrors, we all know what's there. And I think that truth is becoming more real for many people as they see, not just the actions of Israel itself, but the actions of the U.S. establishment, right, in protecting Israel.
That's right.
And I was going to mention also, in terms of the international consensus, every year for the past 30 or so years, Cuba has put forward a resolution at the UN General Convention that is titled something like "The Necessity of Ending the U.S. Blockade on Cuba," something like that. The last 2 years, virtually every country in the world has voted to adopt this resolution. These are U.S. allies. This is the West. This is the East. This is the South. 187 countries, except for 2. And the 2 are the United States and Israel, right? Those are the 2 countries that routinely vote down this resolution. So even at the UN, on the international stage, amongst our allies, we are isolated on this issue. Everybody knows what's going on, as Mark said. And that's one of the more frustrating things. Everyone knows what's going on. Very few people will say it, right? And it's kind of this dirty secret in a way. But it's very interesting when you go to the UN for these proceedings, the types of arguments that you hear, like from France would argue, oh, this is like a unilateral imposition on our sovereignty because you're impacting our ability to trade with Cuba. Whereas like a country in the global south would say, Cuba is the most solidaristic country in the world. It's ridiculous that we charge them as a state sponsor of terror. Yeah.
Thank you, Danny. And Mark, I think you wanted to say something. And then before we finish, I want to go to Leo for the same thing in solidarity with Venezuela, and we'll wrap up the call. So go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, just one kind of 60-second thing. Danny mentioned about the salience of these issues can really make a difference. And I think that's especially true for sanctions. I think that the reason that the sanctions have become increasingly the preferred form of violence for our government in maintaining its hegemony is because nobody knows. When they bomb a wedding in Afghanistan or an apartment building or anywhere, everybody sees it, and even if it doesn't become a huge issue, it's noticed. And the sanctions, they really have managed to keep it pretty quiet.
Yeah, and I think there's something about human processing of information there, where it's a similar thing with, let's say, climate change, that because it's sort of long and slow and not extremely bombastic all the time until it is, right? Then we have these explosions of floods and wild weather events and all that stuff. But it's a very similar thing where it's able to remain an undercurrent because people aren't dying in explosions, but it is a slow motion genocide, right? It is a slow motion stripping away of the things people need. And there's just, as you said, Mark, it's indefensible. There's no, especially in the case of Cuba, which is like, this is the product of a Cold War, of, a global dynamic that no longer even exists anymore, right? And they're still trapped in this cycle of just having this economic boot under them all the time.
And Leo, any last words from you in terms of how we can show solidarity with the Venezuelan people?
Sure. And my answer actually kind of dovetails a little bit with a question I saw in the chat, which is how can we do this internationally, fighting ICE abuses like Alligator Alcatraz? And I think the answer to both of those is that, first of all, realizing that that sanctions are a driving force of migration, particularly in the case of Cuba and Venezuela to the United States. There's study after study that's shown this. We can see this in the number of migrants that have come from Venezuela or Cuba over the last 5 to 10 years. And really, at the Venezuelan Solidarity Network, that's become our main concern over sanctions, because we don't see much movement happening, not just under the Trump administration, but particularly with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who was the architect of both the maximum pressure policies against Venezuela and Cuba when he was a senator during the Trump administration. So I don't think anything's going to happen, by appealing to the executive or even to Congress in the short term. But in the medium and long term, how you can be in solidarity with Venezuelans is, first of all, engage in political education about sanctions. Secondly, really bring up the fact that Venezuelan migrants are here and they were really betrayed by the Trump administration, because the Trump administration imposed horrible sanctions on Venezuela that drove millions of Venezuelans out. And now the ones who have come to the United States are being betrayed because they're being deported and they're being sent back. And the two main programs, whether it's TPS or the humanitarian parole, that allowed Venezuelans to come to the country legally, have now been rescinded by the Trump administration. In fact, the Trump administration has sent 252 Venezuelans to one of the worst torture prisons in the world, which is CICOT, which is the prison in El Salvador. Right now, there's 21 Venezuelan children and infants who have been separated by their parents and are currently in foster care in the US, and their parents are either in prison in El Salvador or in Venezuela, and there seems to be no way to get these kids home. So talking about ICE and talking about migration and drawing those connections between sanctions and migration are really key for building more political education, which is going to be important because, maybe we can't do anything during the remainder of Trump's time in office, but if we get a different kind of government in place, 4 years from now or whenever, we might have an opportunity to do something else. And I feel like we said that, 5 years ago before Biden won, and we failed in that regard. But we also have big victories, and Mark mentioned some of them. But really, I think the biggest thing of all is that I've seen a change in in the rhetoric around sanctions. Right? 6 years ago, if you talked about sanctions as warfare, maybe hardcore peace activists were the only ones who were listening. But now a lot of more people are listening. And I think it was about a year and a half ago, maybe Mark, you can correct me. The Washington Post had a series of articles on sanctions, maybe six articles, I believe it was, and how sanctions are not just counterproductive, but how they're harming people on the ground. And that before, we wouldn't have talked about that 10 years ago, 5 years ago. So I think what we're doing, progress may be very slow, but we are changing people's minds. And we have to continue, not just in terms of political education, but reaching out to our members of Congress to let them know that this is an issue that we still care about, even though we understand that it might not be a priority right now, given everything that's going on with ICE or the genocide in Gaza.
And the deep root of all of this is colonialism and imperialism, right?
Absolutely.
And I'll also add, in the case of Cuba, a great thing that you can do is travel to Cuba. It's still why you still can. It's not as complicated as you might think. You need a special visa, but all of that is very attainable. And you can go to Cuba and see it for yourself. I mean, it's a country that will just completely amaze you in certain ways and totally gut you in others, right? It's a place of a lot of contradictions that are the manifestation of everything that we're talking about. So that's one of the other things, and the things like the Cubans I work with ask me to say all the time. It's like, please come to Cuba, travel to Cuba. They want us to come there. So that's another important thing.
And it's really interesting because a lot of people in Iran say the same thing. If you have an opportunity, come see the country. And it's just this movement to humanize our people, right? They want
Definitely.
to be seen, right? And not be painted through the other's story, which is really important. I do want to send all of my heartfelt gratitude to all of you, Leo, to Danny, Mark, for being here, taking so much of your time to talk about this issue. When I was talking to Norman Solomon, co-founder of RootsAction, I said this is going to be the first of very many conversations that we do have about this subject matter. So I look forward to organizing our second round of talks and include some of our Iranian experts on this subject matter. For those of you who want to stay in contact with our wonderful speakers, if you want to share your Instagram handles and your Twitter handles, please do so in the chat. This has been brought to you by the Teach-In Network, who my colleague Ryan posted our website in the chat, and hopefully you'll see both Danny, Leo, and Mark as our guest speakers on the website soon. The invitation is coming. What I want to conclude with is that no mother should see the starvation of their children from the West Bank to Iran to Venezuela to Cuba, and so many countries that have been just brutally crippled by U.S. foreign policy. I do want to thank every single one of you for being here tonight. This was a fantastic conversation, and I'm sure our guests who have stayed with us for this long feel the same way. And with that said, it's 6:11. I do want to say good night to all of you, and we look forward to our second round of conversations around sanctions. Have a blessed night.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
us.
Thanks very much.
Bye, Mark.
Bye-bye.